very happy to be here with Dan Wang. He is a research fellow currently at the Hoover Institution. He's just written a new book that's gotten quite a lot of attention called Breakneck, comparing China and the United States, and a lot of other ideas too. So I want to get into, it's a pretty rich book, and I think some of the other reviews have focused on, the kind of core argument, but have missed a lot of the points that I think are quite interesting. Why don't you just summarize the base argument about how the United States and China differ?
It's great to be chatting with you, Frank, and I think just as a preview for our readers, I will later on grill you a little bit about your views on China, and so that's just a little preview. And the very simple idea that animates my book is that China is a country I call the engineering state because it has leadership that is intent on engineering the physical environment, as well as the economy, as well as society. And the United States is a country I call the lawyerly society because all the elites are trained at the Yale Law School.
Yeah, well, most of them. And what are the consequences, the social and economic consequences?
I think some part of China's economic success is due to a literal-minded engineering approach to economic growth. In the days of Hu Jintao, before Xi Jinping, being a Communist Party official was relatively straightforward. You had two metrics to hit. One was that you would maximize the GDP growth in your jurisdiction. Second was that you would minimize the number of mass incidents, sort of their euphemism for protests in their jurisdiction. And if you are able to generate high economic growth without too many protests and demonstrate that you're able to build roads and bridges and subway stations and parks, that was a pretty straightforward program for advancement within the Communist Party. Now, Xi Jinping has muddied the waters a little bit with all sorts of metrics. It's poverty alleviation this week and environmental protection the next week. But for a while, it felt like an engineering exercise to just focus on economic growth. Mm-hmm. I think for the most part, that has been broadly positive with China to demonstrate much greater growth than India or Indonesia, other nearby countries. That was pretty positive. When it comes to social engineering, I think that it is overwhelmingly negative. They put the population into these boxes. You may have to go through the HUKO, household registration program, in which if you are a person living in rural areas, you cannot very easily move to Shanghai or Beijing, where opportunities are much better. If you are Tibetan in Tibet or an Uyghur in Xinjiang, the Communist Party has put a lot of emphasis into synicizing your faith. And then there are big social engineering projects, which I write about in my book, Zero COVID, which I lived through, as well as the one-child policy.
Mm-hmm. We'll get into that further in a minute, but one thing I thought was interesting, actually, and underappreciated, was your take on American politics. So you're a fan of the abundance movement, which is directly aimed at those lawyers that you say are really good at stopping stuff from happening. Maybe you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I would say it is maybe nicely aimed at the lawyers who are trying to stop stuff. I think that, the abundance agenda, as I understand it, is that it is trying to do two things. The first is to increase state capacity, and then the second is to make supply a much greater focus of the left. The American left tends to deal with every problem through another subsidy program. And when supply is constrained, as it is in many big cities, if you give rent subsidies to people, that simply drives up the cost of rent and the landlord's pocket the entire difference. And so I see the abundance agenda as speaking mostly to the left, in which my view is that blue states like California, Massachusetts, and New York have manifestly not built enough housing in their states. You get these absurd projects like it's taking 20 years to add a bus lane to Van Ness Avenue, or having New York City subway extensions come in at costs at something like 8 or 9 times the levels in Madrid or Paris. So I am, optimistic that abundance can speak a little bit more to the degrowther leftists who have gummed up too many of the words. I think that one criticism of parts of the abundance agenda, especially as embraced by Ezra Klein as well as Derek Thompson, is that they were a little bit too nice with so many of these interest groups. They can identify that there are interest groups as specified through folks like Mansur Olson, but they're not really punching hard enough at them. My view is that they have not been mean enough to the law schools as well as the law professors. There's now greater self-consciousness among the law professors that there should be a little bit of a shift away from valuing social impact litigation as the core objective of law students, and tying up the hands of the state as the core objective of lawyers, to move away a little bit from that. But I think it is good to open with something softer and then think about harder reforms later.
Yeah. No, it's interesting. I think young people interested in social justice these days in the United States tend to go to law school so that they can actually learn how to sue the government, because in a way the government is the big enemy that's been captured by corporate America and isn't paying attention to the social impacts of the programs it runs, and they don't want to go to work for the government. They don't want to add to the state capacity of the United States to actually do good, and that's a really big change from the days of the New Deal, when you had all these brilliant people actually signing up to go work for the state.
There's a really excellent book, Public Citizens, by Professor Paul Sabin at Yale, who traced through, there was kind of one figure that was really responsible for this change, and it was Ralph Nader. And Ralph Nader, who led a lot of the consumer interest movement, decided to be a, quote, watchdog of the government, that he rallied other elite law students throughout the 1960s and 70s to say, sue the bastards, and the bastards referred to the U.S. government. And now they really shifted the mindset of a lot of these sort of students to constrain the ability of the government to do stuff. And it flowed supernaturally into Ronald Reagan's dictum that government is the problem, not the solution. It would have been impossible to tell whether it was the left, liberal left of the 70s, or the right who was saying something like that. I want to get your view of abundance. What are its strengths? What are its weaknesses?
Well, I pretty much agree with the underlying analysis. I think that there's both a political and then a normative imperative behind it. So the political one is that, I think the lawyerly gumming up of the ability of America to build stuff is actually what creates Trumpism. Because, what are Trump and Elon Musk all about? It's like just bulldozing all these regulations and not listening to the law, breaking the law when necessary in order to get stuff done. And we need to get stuff done, but it shouldn't be, simply by ignoring the law. You really need to reform, let's say, the permitting process and make it more, effective. The part that I think needs to be fleshed out, and that this group, Reform for Results, that I'm running at Stanford, is trying to figure out is how to actually implement abundance, because they're pretty light on the details. There's a political challenge, which has to do with what they call the groups. So the Democratic Party is full of these sometimes single-issue groups, on abortion, women's rights, workers' rights, environment, and any candidate that runs in that party, really they give a questionnaire to, and if you don't answer it the right way, you're never going to make it. And that's going to be one of the big challenges for any abundance Democrat that wants to run on this ticket, is how do you deal with the groups? And they're not going to want power taken away from them. And it is a zero-sum game. I mean, either the abundance agenda is going to actually succeed in getting stuff done, or these groups are going to, be able to stop it. So that's something I think that really needs to be fleshed out.
I wonder about your view of California right now. I mean, California is the most anti-growth state, and that has
No,
a long.
Hawaii is the most anti-growth
Okay,
state.
Hawaii. Well, it's pretty near neighbors,
Yeah.
but these two places, which are obviously pristine and beautiful, and then these people move in, and then they pull up the ladder. I think that is there's something very obscene about that sort of a behavior. Understandable, but I would say obscene. But there are certain ways in which California is reforming itself to build a little bit more. I'm not sure if this is through confrontation with the groups, but there is enough of a sense that things need to change.
There's a YIMBY movement, a Yes in My Backyard movement that has chapters in many parts of California. Gavin Newsom, I think, has been definitely trying to move to the center on some of these issues. So we have this wonderful law called CEQA, the California Environmental Quality Act, that allows any resident of California to sue any project they want anonymously, and they do. And so they've been trying to cut out certain projects from CEQA, litigation. I think they actually need to do a much more fundamental revision, reduce the, for example, only about 11% of CEQA lawsuits are actually launched by an environmental group. The others are launched by labor unions or business competitors or NIMBY neighbors that really don't care about the environment. They're just using this law as a way of stopping stuff that they don't like. And so there's ways that you can, I think, more fundamentally change the application of CEQA to make it easy. So I don't think we need to get into all of those details, but I do want to talk about your discussion of a couple of issues. So let's just begin with the whole problem of outsourcing to China. I think you quoted this, it was Michael Boskin or some Reagan-era official saying it doesn't matter whether you make computer chips or potato chips, whoever does either one the most efficiently, that's fine in the International Division of Labor. And you make an argument that I think a lot of the free market economists in that period really they had a deep misunderstanding about, the nature of the manufacturing economy, which many of them thought, the United States is now into services, information, we could leave all that to somebody else. What was the problem with there?
I think that Michael Boskin's remark, my dear colleague at Hoover, I think it was a fun but a little bit too glib of a remark to say that there's no difference between computer chips and potato chips. Well, I think there is a difference between computer chips and potato chips, that countries can grow moderately prosperous by producing crops like potatoes, and maybe this is kind of Argentina at the start of the 20th century. But if you are able to make computer chips, that really guarantees that you have the technological complexity to really advance into the front ranks of economic development in a way that Argentina has not achieved. And a lot of my thinking about this has been drawn from my 6 years of living in China. I started out in Hong Kong, then I moved to Beijing, and then I moved to Shanghai. And when I was in Hong Kong, I every so often took the train or the ferry over to the nearby city of Shenzhen just to kick the tires a little bit and see what it was like.
You were working then as an analyst?
I was a technology analyst at a firm called Gofcal Dragonomics, thinking mostly about China's chip sector manufacturing. Writing research notes for a predominantly finance, hedge fund, pensions, endowments audience, trying to get a little bit deeper than the Wall Street Journal or Bloomberg headlines on China. And a lot of what I was seeing in Shenzhen was this frenetic pace of new product creation that felt vibrantly exciting to me. Now, Frank, I think you would appreciate this analogy. Shenzhen, I think, is the hardware capital of the world, and it really feels like China's answer to San Jose, which is this set of boring office parks, parking garages everywhere. Not that much exciting culture, but absolutely the center of the technologically accelerating universe in terms of especially hardware. And when I was going to Shenzhen, I was seeing the peace dividends of the smartphone wars, which was a phrase from Chris Anderson, talking about how companies that started from Apple onwards, but also many other companies, invested hundreds of billions of dollars into the smartphone supply chain, such that these cameras, which would have been military grade 30 years ago, are just exceptional objects we all carry around in our pockets. And what folks in Shenzhen were doing were, taking all of these new components from the smartphone supply chain, these remarkable improvements in capacity, as well as reductions in price for not only cameras, but also batteries, all sorts of these little engines, and reconstituting them into something like the consumer drone, which is, made up of battery, different sensors, propeller, obviously the camera as well, that the Shenzhen was almost uniquely able to put together.
Yeah. By the way, one of my hobbies is being an FPV drone pilot. So I've and DJI is one of the companies in Shenzhen that did exactly what you've just described.
Indeed, DJI is making something like 80% of all the drones in the world. The American consumer drones have not kept up with this competition. Tell me about DJI.
Well, I started this actually when I first moved back to California in 2010, and actually Chris Anderson is part of the story because he had one of the only consumer grade drone company, American drone company, something called US Robotics. And I bought one of their drones, and I bought a DJI drone way back then. And basically, the US I'm sorry if Chris Anderson hears this, I apologize, but...
We're going to send it to him afterwards.
Yeah, okay. It was not a good drone. It really was very hard to stabilize. I had a lot of trouble getting that thing working. The DJI drone, all the way back 15 years ago, flew right out of the box. Very easy to control. They had obviously figured out the stabilization algorithm, in it, and to this day, there is not a U.S. manufacturer of a sub-$1,000 consumer drone, and it's crazy because the entire war in Ukraine is now being fought between two sides using these very cheap, consumer drones, and we can't produce one. I mean, even after all the political incentives to get this done. And so there's something really wrong, I think, in our industrial system that, can't supply that need.
What are you using drones for, Frank?
Just for fun. One of my hobbies is photography, and I've been moving into videography. And I always wanted to be able to take, aerial photographs of beautiful landscapes. And you can do that with one of these, except that the state of California won't let you fly over any part of the state that's actually you'd really want to photograph, but that was the objective.
I am learning so many great things about you, Frank. Photography, you have been a woodworker, but we'll get into that. I think something I think you would appreciate with, because that you are a hewer of wood, that working with your hands is something quite important. I've been to several Apple contracting companies, and you walk through these companies in which people are dressed up in uniforms. If I ever go into an Apple supplier, I would go through probably 3 to 4 levels of security to make sure that I haven't pocketed any of their new products. Everyone is moving into the cafeteria at exactly the same time. You get these giant waves of people. Really feels like military precision over there in a way that I think the Chinese have been able to do quite well. And I was always struck walking through some of these factories that these people are labeled as unskilled workers, and I am labeled as a skilled worker. And this is completely ridiculous that these people are able to do such wonders with their hands, and all I'm able to do is email by typing on a keyboard. And so I'm much more impressed by people like that.
Yeah.
It was hanging out in places like Shenzhen that really made me realize that there's different things that we need to understand as technology. I think the first part of technology is the hardware and the equipment, all of these things that we can physically touch and grasp and move around. And there's a second aspect of technology, which is written instruction, everything that includes patents and blueprints and recipes. The third and the most important part of technology is the process knowledge of everything that is impossible to write down, that exists in people's heads and between people's heads, that constitute communities of engineering practice.
Mm-hmm.
And I think this is, we are sitting here at Stanford University. I think this is abundantly clear to all of us at universities that teaching cannot be only through lectures, that there has to be some other component going on here. Otherwise, the students can just watch all of these on YouTube or wherever else. That all of us who have essentially email jobs like mine, it is really difficult to transfer skills, even in these office workers. And I'm really struck that, in places like Shenzhen, another example that I bring up, the Ise Grand Shrine in Japan. This is one of these core holy Shinto shrines in Japan that people tear down this shrine every 25 years, essentially one generation, and then rebuild it in the next spot, essentially to transfer knowledge of wood joinery, as well as a lot of other parts of woodworking. And so I think that sort of explicit instruction where people are meant to observe and learn and then have a mandate to transfer skills in the future, that's something that I don't know if this is just more common among East Asian culture. I don't know what sort of component there is here, but it also feels like something that the Americans don't prize enough because they are distracted by the shiny objects, sometimes quite literally, or they believe that they can write these exquisite manuals and then people just know what to do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's funny that America prides itself as an egalitarian society, but actually there is a very strict social hierarchy, and people that work with their minds are paid higher salaries, given much greater social status than people that know how to do things, in the mechanical world. It's not true of all Western countries. Germany and Japan still have a tradition of manufacturing. So, for example, in Japan, they have this national treasure. There's like 100 people that are singled
Living
out as
national treasures, right?
And some of them are machinists. That can do really very precise machining of parts on which any kind of precision manufacturing depends. Germans and the Swiss, I think have similar kinds of. They've retained, or they've tried to retain, similar kinds of manual skills. In the United States, we just said, okay, that's something that can be done by somebody else, for lower pay in a foreign country, and we didn't really bother to hang on to those.
So why don't we bring that idea to the U.S.? I mean, the people who are really celebrated and feted in the U.S. are these pop stars and influencers and maybe these business leaders who crave some degree of prestige, and that's all fine. But why don't we designate certain people as living national treasures, whether that is a baker or whether that is some sort of a machinist or someone making, wood joinery, whatever it is. There should be some way to designate that, honor the people here, craftspeople in America, right?
Yeah, there's a book by Matt Crawford called Shopcraft as Soulcraft. I reviewed it in the New York Times Book Review. I helped it become actually a bestseller at the time. But he makes a, similar point that in high schools all over the United States, shop classes were being displaced by computer graphics. Under this theory that everybody had to move up the value-added chain and abandon these manual kinds of skills. He himself is an auto mechanic. He's just rebuilt this Volkswagen. He put a Mazda engine in it, and and he describes he ran a motorcycle shop because he became disillusioned with the kind of service, intellectually based economy, and repaired motorcycles for for a number of years. But he has a really beautiful chapter in which he describes reboring a four-cylinder engine and the kind of skill that's required that you can only do by actually having done it yourself and watching somebody else do it, because you have to feel for the tolerances and and that sort of thing. So that would be great if we could bring that back, but I don't see any inclination. The rewards go to people that write software and work with their work behind computer terminals.
But I feel like this cannot be a lost cause. There are all sorts of strange reservoirs of prestige that exist all over America. I don't know, Pulitzer Prizes here and MacArthur Awards there, and Stanford itself has some sort of prestige. And so maybe this could just be something like the Stanford Award for Wood Joinery. I think that should be something that's achievable.
Yeah, no, that's a revolution that you could imagine happening, and it would be a good thing if it did. All right, so we had a big problem with outsourcing because we kind of looked down on a certain set of skills that were involved in manufacturing, and now we're kind of stuck because it's very hard to recreate them. One of the things I thought was interesting was your description of the way a lot of these Chinese manufacturers could switch from doing auto parts to, making masks for PPE, during the COVID epidemic, and that seems to be a skill that has been lost in the United States.
And that is something I feel like is something to do with the Chinese dispensation for being pretty pragmatic. I feel like the Chinese can often be just a super pragmatic people. If the rules change, they just change with it without questioning why are the rules changing. And one of maybe the best quote I've ever heard from someone in my 6 years of living in China and interviewing a lot of factory managers and business people is that, it was speaking to a factory manager who worked for a Chinese affiliate of an American firm, and he told me that during the early days of the COVID pandemic, too many American firms were asking whether making masks and cotton swabs aligned with their, quote, core competence. And for most people, that answer is no. Among the Chinese, most factory managers decided that making money is their core competence. And they follow the market. And the market tells them to go make masks, and so they go make masks. And so I was wearing masks when I was living in Beijing and Shanghai. First from Foxconn, which is the maker of iPhones. And then JD.com, which is one of China's big e-commerce platforms that directly is kind of like the Amazon Basics masks that worked, that I was using. And there's all sorts of these other kind of assumptions in China which seem quite different in the US. So, Tim Cook is famous for saying something like, inventory is evil, you need just-in-time production. We learned from the Toyota production method in which everything moves like this well-choreographed dance. And the challenge with that is that everything is poised exquisitely for perfection at all times. And if something breaks down, it becomes really difficult to retool a lot of these different processes. And although I wasn't living in America in the early days of COVID, people were complaining about whichever berries would disappear in their grocery store depending on which part of California or Mexico was really ravaged by the pandemic at the time. And a lot of economists would make fun of Chinese state-owned enterprises for being quote unquote inefficient, mostly because they have too much staff, too much spare capacity. And I get it. A lot of these processes could be improved. They should use more software, and maybe they should learn a little bit more about the Toyota, Apple production method. But just having a lot of spare hands in place, which they can activate in a crisis, I think there has to be something to that idea in which we are not always exquisitely poised for perfection.
Yeah, well, labor shortages have been a bane of a lot of American manufacturers at different skill levels. I mean, they don't have the production engineers that China does, but just people that are going to show up, without having a drug habit or, without a lot of absenteeism is also a big problem in the American labor market. So, okay, let's move on to what was one of the most difficult chapters to read, which was the chapter on the one-child policy. So you are not a total fan of the engineering state, and in fact you argue that the engineering state has some real downsides. You've alluded to this already. So why don't you talk a little bit about, what happened as a result of one child?
Let's go to the year roughly 1979 when Deng Xiaoping had inherited the country, or rather seized power as paramount leader via Hua Guofeng after the Mao Zedong years. And Deng surveyed the wreckage of the country, which was totally devastated by the Cultural Revolution under Mao. And he asked, what was Mao Zedong? Mao was first and foremost a poet. Second, some sort of strange romantic. Third, he was a warlord that is responsible for the deaths of tens of millions of Chinese people. And, what is the opposite of a poet? Well, surely the answer is engineers. And so this is when Deng Xiaoping started promoting a lot of people trained in engineering of a very Soviet style into the Central Committee as well as the Politburo. And who are some of the most prized people within the communist state? It wasn't so much the economists who were pointing out all of the problems with Mao's Marxist analyses of the economy. Rather, it was the military scientists who were building the bomb for Mao, as well as helping with other big projects to achieve deterrence or national greatness. So out of this charismatic set of military scientists was one particular guy named Song Jian, who was a missile scientist. He was a brilliant mathematician. He co-authored one of the big cybernetics textbooks in China, and he whispered into the ears of China's leadership, Deng Xiaoping, who was the top leader, as well as Cheng Yun, who managed the economy. There is a elegant solution to China's overpopulation problem. And Cheng Yun and Deng Xiaoping knew that China's population was large, but when they learned that China would have over 1 billion people, they were pretty shocked, and they were fearful that so many mouths would ruin this economic modernization, which the two of them were super interested in encouraging. And so Song Jian proposed the one-child policy, which sounded so elegant. I think that there is some sort of bureaucratic appeal to both Cheng Yun as well as Deng Xiaoping, who know how local officials react to central government edicts. If you tell them, your target is 1, that's just enforceable.
Nice round number.
Nice round number. Very little ambiguity. It's not 1.5. It's not 2.1. Some strange number like that. They know what to do. And so, after you had this military scientist influence population policy, that's the first crazy part. The second crazy part was the actual enforcement of the one-child policy, which I describe in my book as a campaign of rural terror meted out against overwhelmingly female bodies. And so, according to China's official statistics, over the 35 years of the one-child period from 1980 to 2015, China delivered about 300 million abortions. It sterilized 100 million women and 25 million men in often brutal processes throughout the countryside.
A lot of late-term abortions.
A lot of late-term forced abortions, a lot of posses of essentially thugs going up to women and families trying to, quote, persuade them to give up their pregnancies for the good of the nation. And a lot of these methods were anything but persuasive, in fact, ended up being quite coercive. There are so many stories of little baby, almost overwhelmingly girls, being left outside to die of exposure, being given to other families. There is something like 40 million missing girls because of the male preference, son preference among Chinese families at the time. And so this was just a super brutal process that the Chinese state meted out against the population that I think essentially left no family untouched for 35 years. And so, this is one of these very strange things in which they were seduced by some form of scientism, used an engineering approach, put a former major general of the People's Liberation Army in charge of running the Family Planning Commission, and then delivered vast traumas throughout families over the period of mostly a decade, but throughout 35 years.
Yeah, and it's also a good argument against autocratic decision making, because the autocrat doesn't really have to bounce ideas off of a whole lot of people and doesn't necessarily respond to criticism or, setbacks and that sort of thing.
And ironically, it was bad cybernetics, because cybernetics really has to incorporate feedback loops into the system, and there was essentially no feedback loops. It was just this one guy handing down this sort of a decision, and then getting out of the way and being serenely untroubled by what was happening throughout the countryside. I'm glad that you picked up this chapter, Frank, because it was definitely my favorite chapter to research and write as an author. Why did it speak to you?
Well, I think I understood that one child was a really difficult policy to enforce, but I didn't really understand the depth of the suffering that had been created by the enforcement of that policy, and just the intimate way the Chinese state was interfering in the lives of, so many millions of women. And the scale of the thing is just mind-boggling, those 40 million missing girls. And then, the way it was implemented, basically a lot of it was not abortion, it was infanticide, right? And that's really a terrible idea that a modern state could be, engaged in something like that.
Yeah.
So